I'm Kevin McKernan. I'm going to give you a very fast whirlwind tour through the DNA contamination that's in these vaccines. I've got about a 28-year history in genomics. I worked on the Human Genome Project. I've built DNA sequencers, lots of patents and citations, but I don't have a doctorate, and so I appreciate you guys giving me one on my tag. I don't have any conflicts. Many of the slides I have are for reference for the video. There'll just be citations. I believe having citations here is very important so you understand where I'm going with this. This really pertains to two preprints that came out, one last year in April and one in October, those two. Now, these are preprints. Some of my favorite memes about preprints is that many people took these things under duress, but some people took them for donuts, and even in Portland, Oregon, they had a Joints for Jabs program. Which surprisingly may have been a mistake in disguise, because cannabinoids probably have a role in limiting the inflammation of these shots. But we don't really care about peer review, as Pierre Corey has mentioned. We care about reproduction in science. Okay, peer review is meant to be a proxy for reproduction, but it often fails. What we do have is reproduction in spades. We now have people in Germany, Japan, we have people in France who have seen this DNA contamination. The EMA even has documents that have leaked showing there is a 1 to 815-fold variance in the amount of DNA contamination there in these vaccines. That was data that was given to them, cherry-picked by Pfizer. We also have Dr. Buckholz's work in South Carolina that has replicated this qPCR. He's even done Oxford nanopore sequencing on this. Dr. Sin Lee has done Sanger sequencing in Connecticut. Dr. Bridget Koning has done work in Germany. This much reproduction has forced the regulators to respond. We've got responses now from the FDA, from the EMA, and from Health Canada that have all acknowledged this contamination is there. Now, they disagree that it matters because they turn to their sponsors to get that answer. They've gone to Pfizer and asked them what is in these shots and doesn't matter, and they were handed an answer saying it's of no consequence. I'm going to show you why they're wrong on those 3 points. Let's back up a little bit. What happened here? In the clinical trials, they actually ran the clinical trial on clean DNA that was PCR amplified from a plasmid template. All right, that makes it 1 million-fold cleaner above background. They then did a bait and switch, and when they went to the mass market with this, they gave everyone vaccines that skipped that PCR step and therefore was working off of plasmid DNA alone. What that means is more background DNA from the plasmid gets into the vaccines and more endotoxin presumably gets into the vaccines. This bait and switch was documented in the BMJ. They've been one of the better journals throughout the pandemic. Recep Levy had published this. So what did they hand to the regulators? They handed the regulators this plasmid map on the right, which you'll notice is missing any sequence annotation from 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock on the map. That's very awkward. If you ever use plasmid annotation tools, they annotate everything on the map and they don't leave anything unannotated. So somebody at Pfizer had to go in and actively delete this annotation and hand it to the regulators and defraud them. On the left is what happened when we shoved this into a typical annotation tool. It highlights this SV40 region. So what are they hiding in the SV40 promoter region? Well, they're hiding the fact that this tool identifies their system as a gene therapy because it's a nuclear targeting sequencing. It moves DNA directly to the nucleus within hours in all cell lines, all right? Now, they've also tried to attack the fact that we used expired vials. It's not true. We've had other people use vials that aren't expired, and this is a really bad position of theirs to take because they gave expired vials to patients. And it's very easy for you to measure whether something has decayed with an RNA integrity plot, and we've done that, so this is a red herring. It's also a little bit bizarre. They've challenged that our PCR results aren't using proper methods. They have not published their methods. But you can go to Moderna's own patents, which will teach you that qPCR underestimates the problem, and therefore they had to invent new tools to get rid of this DNA. Moderna does have cleaner vaccines, by the way, from a DNA standpoint. Why did they do this? Well, the regulators in some jurisdictions are letting them measure the DNA with 2 different yardsticks, and they care about a ratio of RNA to DNA. So what they do is they use a different method that inflates the RNA values, something known as fluorometry, and then they move to qPCR to measure the DNA. Now, you've all probably had a COVID test or know that they measure RNA. So if you have primers that can measure DNA and you don't use them to measure the RNA, you are a fraud. And the regulators either don't know this or they are complicit in the crime. They're letting them use 2 different yardsticks so that because without these 2 different yardsticks, they can't pass these regulations. So what is fluorometry? I'll briefly go through this. It's a dye that stains DNA, but sometimes it stains a little RNA when it's modified. So you have to play some tricks where you stain it first with a dye, then erase the RNA with an enzyme known as RNase, and then measure it again. We've done this work, and you can see that it goes down about a log scale in signal when you measure this with Pico Green. If you erase the RNA, it goes down a log scale. It's still a log scale over if you use this tool. This is what we've been complaining about, is they're cherry-picking tools, and by some of the own tools that they're allowed to use with the EMA, they're over by a factor of 10. Very recently, we've measured some vials in Germany that are with qPCR, which is the conservative way to measure this. They're over by a factor of 20. This is 20-fold more DNA than we've ever seen in any other vaccine. This is very recent data. These are giving us CTs of 12, 13. If you remember COVID, you may have been called positive on the outside of your mucosa from a viral test that has CT of 35. That's 1 million times less nucleic acid than they are injecting into you as a contaminant in their vaccines. Big difference there. Oh, I think I just missed one slide there. Okay, the FDA has guidelines that when the DNA gets really small, you have to lower the limits. These guidelines are also based on non-LNP based delivery. DNA has about a 10-minute half-life in the blood. If you put it in an LNP, it goes all over the place and lasts forever. Well, I shouldn't say forever, but we don't know how long it goes, but it goes into the cell once you do this. This Limit All paper is a great paper about spontaneous integration rates into the genome. It's around 7% if you use transfection with something like an LNP. So keep that in mind. 10 nanograms of small DNA, which is what we have here, is billions of copies of DNA. 10 nanograms of human DNA is only about 1,000 copies of DNA. So they base their regulations on old numbers. It's also important to know that the NCVIA, since that went into place, they have raised the limit 1,000-fold in a couple decades. It used to be 10 picograms, it's now 10 nanograms, and we now have LNPs in the picture with nuclear targeting sequences. Where is it going? Well, we can tell it's going to the heart from the Crossan paper, there for 30 days. It's going to breast milk from the Hanna papers. It's going to placenta recently found, and we can see it's in plasma for 28 days. Most of these papers are not discriminating between RNA and DNA, so we don't really know whether they're measuring the spike of the RNA or the DNA. It's probably a combination of both. Okay, can this lead to cancer? I think we're always cancering. It's just a question of whether your immune system can keep up with it. If you accelerate the mutation rate, your immune system may not be keep up with it. If you take one of these vaccines, you won't have any white blood cells to keep up with it. And likewise, if you're producing a spike protein, there's some publications that this can reduce the activity of P53. All three of these in combination are probably what's required. I don't think the DNA alone is going to do this, but when you give it in combination with white blood cell neutropenia and lymphocytopenia, this is quite likely. Okay, so let's go over why they're wrong. So the FDA, when they were shown that they had this contamination and admitted to being deceived, they then turned to the people who deceived them to ask them how bad is the deception. And of course, they got the answer they're looking for, which Pfizer told them that these things are not material to manufacturing the plasmid. Having worked on the Human Genome Project, building 10 million plasmids, it is impossible to make a plasmid without a promoter. So this is a complete lie from the FDA, which tells you they're either completely inept or they're in on the crime. They're part of the fix, as Pierre would say. The other thing they've gone on to say is that they're going against their own guidelines. Their guidelines declare these things need to be disclosed. You have to declare every promoter and every open reading frame in any plasmid, and they didn't do this. They admitted that they didn't do this, and they're now running cover for them. So I'm not certain you can believe anything else that they say on this topic. They've nevertheless said the DNA is too small and too little quantity. I've already touched on the fact that it's in LNPs, and that's wrong, and the way that they're measuring things is a fraud. But it's also, in some cases, very long. There's a very long tail of the size of the DNA that's in there. We've collected molecules as long as 3,000 bases out of these vaccines, which encode the entire antibiotic resistance gene and its promoter. That thing integrates, you're going to have cell lines that are now resistant to aminoglycosides. I don't know what that's going to do. It may not be very good for your gut. But they're not doing work. This is a very cheap $90 sequencing run we did in Oxford Nanopore on a Flongle. It gives 1,000 reads, and we can already see 1,000 base pair fragments there or more. When they say this thing is immaterial and is non-functional, well, they have not read Moderna's own patents, which state that residual DNA in their mRNA vaccines is in fact a risk for insertional mutagenesis. So you don't have to take my word that this is a risk. It's in Moderna's own patents that they need to solve this problem, and they're inventing tools in these patents to solve the problem because they are aware of this risk that the FDA refuses to acknowledge is there. Not functional, I don't have much time for this, but there are papers written by the FDA that show it's functional, so we'll cite them back to those from Keith Pedden. And of course, you only needed to do one Google search to find SV40 binding to P53. P53 is your tumor suppressor gene. It's the guardian of your genome. Anything that's in billions of copies inside of a vaccine that binds P53 should be a red light. Stop. Put the brakes on. Let's review what's going on here. I don't know what it's doing to P53, but the fact that it interacts with that gene should be a major alarm bell. Now, very recently, we took ovarian cancer cell lines and treated them with vaccines. This is work that Uli Kaumer did in Germany. She's treated ovarian cancer 3 cells, OVCAR3, with Moderna and some Pfizer vaccines. And then we looked at with qPCR, at the DNA levels in each cell passage. This took about a week's worth of cell culture, okay? And we can see that the DNA is still inside of these cells. So the fact checkers who told you this DNA won't get into the cell are proven wrong by this data. We can see DNA in there. It's a very high copy number. It's at around 3,000x coverage across the vaccine genome, and it's only about 30x coverage across the human genome. And we can now see the DNA sticking within these cells throughout passaging. We've also found 2 genome integrations. Now, this has not been replicated like all of our qPCR data, so this is very early. But we have fusions of DNA between the spike sequence and chromosome 12 and between the spike sequence and chromosome 9. This needs to be confirmed with long-read sequencers where we can span the entire integration event. We couldn't do this with the Illumina sequencing, so this is still somewhat putative at the moment. But we shouldn't be seeing any of this right now. And this didn't take much to do. This took one Illumina run that a regulator could have easily done with the budgets that they have. Instead, this is falling upon citizen scientists to go and look at. We've done some Sanger sequencing to confirm that these junctions are real and they're not an Illumina artifact. They're real and that they exist in the library that we sequenced. We didn't have cells to go back to torture test the cells to see if it was in the cell as well. That's our next action. So a little bit more validation to doing this, but still a little bit concerning. Why is this happening? Others have touched on this. We had 2 regulators leave in protest over these vaccines, and 2 others went and got hired by Moderna. This is a revolving door. It's due to the PDUFA Act of 1992 that needs to be repealed. This allows the pharmaceutical companies to be paid by pharma, and more of their budget comes from pharma than from any taxpayer. So they are not beholden to any citizen vote. They are beholden to the people that they regulate, and that act should be eliminated. All right, so where do we go from here? Blood banks, sperm banks, fertility clinics, breast milk, transplant organs, cancer biopsies, all of these things need to be screened for whether or not any of this residual vaccine exists. We have tools to do this now that we put public. Anyone can manufacture these things. What's really needed are CLIA laboratories to take an interest in this. We can work on cell lines. We can't be working on human consented DNA. That needs CLIA laboratories to do that, so I encourage them to look up these primers. If they don't want to make them themselves, we have some of them kitted for people to make this easy. And I think Joe Ladapo had this right. We have to do this state by state. The FDA is not going to address this. They've already demonstrated fraud. They've already demonstrated they're complicit and they're willing to just take the word of the manufacturer and not give it any scrutiny. And Joe had the courage to actually look at this from a neutral position and decide that the FDA was lying through their teeth. So with that, I'll leave it for the next person. Thank you.